Imagine a figure central to the faith of over 1 billion people, yet whose historical existence is now being questioned. Recent findings challenge centuries-old beliefs about Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, and the origins of one of the world's largest religions. What if the story isn't as it seems? Today, we'll explore the groundbreaking research that casts doubt on Muhammad's historical existence. The story of Muhammad as presented in Islamic tradition is more than just a biography. It forms the foundation of Islamic theology, law, and culture. Muslims are taught that Muhammad lived in Mecca and Medina during the 7th century, receiving revelations that became the Quran. His life is documented through sources like the Hadith and the Sirah, which detail his actions, sayings, and the rise of Islam. But what if these sources aren't as reliable as they seem? Modern scholarship is beginning to uncover significant gaps in the historical narrative. If these findings hold, they could reshape not only how we understand Islam, but also how we view the broader history of the Middle East. Let's start with the sources. The Quran, Hadith, and biographies of Muhammad are considered foundational to Islamic history. However, these texts pose a serious issue. They appear far too late. The Quran itself lacks clear manuscript evidence from the 7th century. While fragments exist, the earliest complete Quranic manuscripts are from the 8th and 9th centuries. This raises questions. If the Quran was truly revealed during Muhammad's lifetime, why don't we have more contemporary evidence? The Hadith, which detail Muhammad's words and deeds, are even more problematic. The 6 canonical collections, such as those of Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, were compiled 200 to 300 years after Muhammad's death. And yet, we have no manuscripts of these collections from that time period. The first physical copies appear several centuries later, during the Ottoman period. The biographies, or Sirah, face similar challenges. The most famous biography by Ibn Ishaq was written over a century after Muhammad's death, and we don't even have his original work. What we know comes from redactions by later authors like Ibn Hisham, who lived even later. If Muhammad's existence is in question, what about the cities most associated with him, Mecca and Medina? Modern archaeological and historical studies reveal a striking lack of evidence for Mecca's significance in the 7th century. Early maps and trade records make no mention of Mecca as a major hub, despite Islamic tradition claiming it was a central city of commerce and religion. Medina fares slightly better in terms of evidence, but even there, the descriptions of theological debates between Muhammad, Christians, and Jews raise doubts. Historical records suggest that the region was sparsely populated at the time, making such encounters unlikely. If these cities weren't as described, then where did the Quran and early Islamic traditions originate? Here's where it gets even more fascinating. Much of what the modern world knows about Muhammad comes not from Muslim sources, but from 19th century European scholars. Heinrich Ferdinand Wüstenfeld, a German Orientalist, compiled the first widely available version of the Sirah. His work pieced together manuscripts written between the 11th and 16th centuries. These manuscripts were already centuries removed from Muhammad's life. This means that the story of Muhammad's life as commonly told today was constructed in large part by Western academics. If this is the case, how reliable is the narrative? Let's return to the Hadith. These texts are vital for Islamic jurisprudence, detailing how Muslims should pray, fast, and conduct their daily lives. Yet, the first manuscripts of major Hadith collections, like those attributed to Bukhari and Muslim, don't appear until the 11th century. That's 400 years after Muhammad's time. Even more concerning is the fact that these manuscripts were heavily edited and redacted over centuries. The versions we have today are the result of later political and theological influences, particularly during the Ottoman period. If the traditional accounts of Muhammad and early Islam can't be supported by contemporary evidence, then where does that leave us? Scholars are now turning to alternative explanations. Some suggest that Islam didn't originate in Mecca and Medina, but in northern regions closer to Christian and Jewish communities, where theological debates were more vibrant. Others propose that Muhammad may have been a composite figure, a blend of multiple leaders and traditions brought together under a unified narrative centuries later. This would explain the inconsistencies in Islamic sources and the delayed emergence of manuscripts. The questions raised by this research are complex and, for many, deeply personal. But they're also necessary. Understanding the past helps us make sense of the present, and in this case, it challenges us to look beyond assumptions and dig deeper into history. Now, let's compare this with Christianity. The New Testament, particularly the Gospels, is built on eyewitness accounts. Scholars agree that Paul's letters, written as early as 50 to 60, just 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death, are among the earliest Christian writings. These letters confirm key aspects of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Archaeological discoveries further back up the Gospel accounts. For instance, the Pool of Bethesda, described in John chapter 5, verse 2, was excavated and matched the description found in the text. Similarly, inscriptions like the Pilate stone confirm the existence of Pontius Pilate, a key figure in Jesus' crucifixion. Unlike Islamic sources, which emerge centuries after Muhammad's supposed time, Christian texts have a trail of documentation and physical evidence that closely aligns with the events they describe. This comparison highlights why examining historical claims critically is so important. Let's keep asking questions and seeking the truth together. Thank you for watching.
Well, I think it'd be worth diving into sort of the history of Islam and the history of Muhammad, because you've been doing this for so long. You've looked at all these sources, you've looked at all these documents and maps, and goodness knows what else. So take us through, like from the point, from sort of, if we can go sort of from the point of Christ's ascension, the church is established, and the gospel's being spread. And then, as far as the Islamic narrative goes, along strolls Muhammad, who's then selected by the angel Jibril to have a revelation from God, from Allah. Where do we go from here? Like, how do we know what's fact and what's fiction?
Okay, right there. Everything you've just said. Do you believe it?
Well, that's the thing. Is that's what we're told, and
from
that's
whom?
it's what we're told from imams, from
and where do the imams
Quran.
get their material? Where do the imams get their material from?
It'd be from the hadiths, the Quran.
And when were the hadiths written?
Well, a couple hundred years after the Quran.
You want to know when?
Go for it.
Al-Bukhari is probably the most famous, right, of the hadith. Al-Bukhari is certainly the most prolific. He's called Sahih for a reason. Sahih means perfect, without error. And that's why everybody quotes him. They have to quote him because he is so prolific. Sahih Bukhari, the first documents we have for Sahih Bukhari, you have been told, come from Al-Bukhari himself, who died in 870. Muhammad died in 632. Already, you're talking about 240 years after the fact. That's bad enough, is it not? Because that means Al-Bukhari never heard Muhammad. He never heard a word he said, and yet he seems to have known everything that Muhammad said. Yet we don't have any documentation at all from 870 or earlier, because he died in 870. So we have nothing from the 9th century. So when is the earliest documentation we have? When is the first extant manuscript for this man named Al-Bukhari? It doesn't appear to the 14th century. Did you hear what I've just said?
Really? The 14th century?
That's 500 years after the fact. We have nothing earlier than that for Al-Bukhari.
Wow.
Now, this is the first time you're hearing it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
It was not the same question asked of our documents? Because remember, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Bukhari, are the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad. We have the same we have the same genre in Christianity. We've got the sayings of Jesus, do we not? In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yes.
The red letters. Whenever you see Jesus speaking, they write it in red letters. That's called the sayings, the hadith of Jesus. And we also have the biography of Jesus. Biography of Jesus is written in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the black letters, the majority part of what Jesus did. Now, we have been asked that since the 1800s of when did those get written down? And we've had to come up with documentation because we can no longer just give them the Sinaiticus or the Alexandrinus or the Vaticanus from the 4th century. We had to go back to the John Rhinan's manuscript. We had to go back to the Bodmer Papyrus there in Switzerland. We had to go back to the Chester Beatty manuscripts, which are from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th. And it wasn't until the 4th century that finally we get an entire New Testament written in Greek that was preserved on parchment so that we can look at it today. The first complete extant manuscript is the Sinaiticus, which is, 325. So we're talking 4th century. And we have been vilified by everybody for that. 400 years later, how can you trust it? Well, look at this. The same genre in Islam that supports the sayings of Muhammad are not written down till the 14th century. Muhammad died in the 7th century. That is 700 years later, and we have nothing earlier than that. Sahih Muslim is the 14th century. Tirmidhi, let me just look at what Tirmidhi is. Tirmidhi would be the 12th century. Nasai, Majah, Ibn Dawud, they're all 13th and 14th century. So we have nothing before the 13th century for any of the hadith. Let's get to the biography of Muhammad. Let's look about that. The black letter of what we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for the biography of Jesus, that would be 4th century for the entirety of it. But we have parts of it in John's Gospel from the 2nd century. Let's see what they have for their biography. That's called the Sirah. The Sirah to Rasulullah. That would be the extant manuscript. Who wrote that down? Every Muslim will tell you, and probably until just now, you would have quoted me if I'd asked you. It'd be Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. Muhammad died in 632. That's 200 years. That's what we have been told. That's what you know. That's what everybody knows. You know, we don't have anything of Ibn Hisham. In fact, the story that you have to read about Muhammad, everything he did that you thought was attributed to Ibn Hisham was written by a guy named Alfred Guillaume, who is a French writer. But he didn't actually do and put the material together. Alfred Guillaume went to a guy in Germany named Wustenfeld. Heinrich Friedrich Wustenfeld is the one that first wrote down the story of Muhammad. And he wrote it down. You want to hear the date? You ready?
Go for it.
Wustenfeld is I want to get it right, 1860. That's the 19th century. Everything we know about Muhammad, what he did, comes from a German scholar writing in Berlin between 1858 and 1860. That 2-year period he put together the story of Muhammad, then published it. Alfred Guillaume then translated it, and that's what we read today. That's the 19th century. That's just 160 years ago. Now, this is the first time you're hearing that, right?
That's incredible. Like so essentially what we hear from the Dawagandis, the people who push Islam and give dawah and things like that, they bring all these things of like, oh, we know everything about Muhammad, it's all been perfectly preserved, we have one Quran, you've got several hundred Bibles and things like that. This is just flipping it on its head.
Puts everything on. Now, we're not talking about the Quran now. Remember, we're not even getting to the Quran. The Quran's even worse. That's a whole nother kettle of fish. We could do a whole nother thing on that because we're talking about Muhammad this time. Just looking at what Muhammad did and said, his sirah and his sayings. And then we get to the tafsir and the tahriq, which would be the commentaries that unpack the Quran, and then the histories that lead up to Muhammad. All of those are attributed to a guy named Al-Tabari, who died in 923. That's the 10th century. We have nothing from 923. Where do we get Al-Tabari? What manuscript do we get? Where is his manuscript? There is none. Not from the 10th century. We have to go to, here you go, 1879 to 1901. And this is a Dutch scholar. His name is, I'm going to get it right, Michael Jan de Geoje, Geoje, however you want to pronounce that. He's a Dutch scholar who was writing in Leiden University there in Holland up until the last century. And he finally tabulated and finalized it in 1901. That's a little over 100 years ago. For all that we know about the commentaries and also the history of Islam and the history of the world. Can you see how incredulous? And this is just getting out now. The Germans are finally bringing this to the fore, and they're feeding it to me, and I'm trying to get it up onto the internet so the world can see it. Can you now understand why we have nothing like this problem in Christianity? We have nothing close to this, because really, our New Testament is nothing more than the Sirah, the Hadith, the Tafsir, and the Tahqiq of Jesus Christ. Those are the genres. Nothing was written by Jesus himself. It was written about him. It was written about what he did. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was written about what he said. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was written about what he meant, about taking it out and applying it. That's the letters of Paul. And then, of course, the history of the early church, that's Luke and the book of Acts. So we have the same genre in the New Testament. So if you want to compare the New Testament and compare it, you need to compare it with the four traditions, the Sirah, the Hadith, the Tafsir, and the Tahqiq. That's what you really have to compare it with. Because we're talking about books that were written by those who saw Jesus, heard Jesus, and then applied what Jesus did in Ephesus and in Corinth and in Philippi and in Rome. That's why do like with like, and when you do like with like, our material starts to appear in the 2nd century, is finalized and completed by the 4th century, taking it from material from people that were writing. Listen, just look at the dates that they were written. Paul was writing his letters the earliest within 15 years of Christ's death. He died in 62 AD. So within 30 years of Christ's death, you already have all of his letters written and the book of Romans written. And then you get Luke's writing. That's within 20 years of Christ's death. You get Mark and you get Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark, who are writing within 40 years of Christ's death. You have Luke, who's written within 50 years of Christ's death, and then you have John, who's written within 60 years of Christ's death. So every one of these four genres, the Hadith, the Sirah, the Tafsir, and the Tahqiq of Jesus Christ, are written within 60 years of Christ's death. Everything we know about Islam is written between 400 to 800 years of Muhammad's death. Which do you think is more authoritative?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're going to do any form of historical work, even looking at things like Alexander the Great or, Genghis Khan, things like that, you look at the earliest possible source you can.
You always do that.
Always. It's just how you do history, and this is something that you hear all the time from Muslims is, your first Bible comes out 400 years after the thing, and no, I'm sorry, when we're looking, with the evidence that you're putting forward now about the real timeline as to the earliest we can genuinely go to our earliest manuscript is damning. It shows that the Muslims cannot use this argument anymore.
They cannot. And I'm not even put this up. What I'm telling you, I'm not even put up on the YouTube yet. You're getting it before I put it up. This is all yet to be put up. You're going to be the first. You're one of the first to hear it. I just got back from Nigeria introducing it there. I was in Ethiopia introducing it. The Africans all know about it. They wanted this first because they're on the battle lines, unlike you are. That's why they need it more than anybody else. But see how much this just destroys the whole edifice of Islam. Now, that's just Muhammad. Take a look and ask and say, where did he come from? Who is this guy? Where is this name Muhammad anywhere in the 7th century? Show me that word Muhammad, written anywhere in the 7th century. Bingo.
Well, yeah, exactly. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Of course, because you're not an Islamicist and you're not a historian. You're not from the 7th century, so I'm asking the wrong purpose. But if anybody's watching who's a historian, who's an expert on the 7th century, show me one reference to the word Muhammad. You notice I'm emphasizing the vowels. There are 3 vowels in that word. U, a, dama, fata, fata. There are no vowels in Arabic, not in the written form in the 7th century. Vowels had yet to be invented. So why are we even looking for Muhammad? There are 4 consonants. Mim, ha, mim, dal. Mim, m, ha, h, mim, again, and m, and then dal, d. M, h, m, d. Those 4 letters are in the name Muhammad. Those 4 letters did exist in the 7th century. They are there in Arabic. They're the same 4 letters. They're also in Aramaic and also in Syriac and also in Hebrew. So if you're looking for Mim, Ha, Mim, Dal, you'll find that everywhere. It's all over the 7th century. It's on coins. It's on inscriptions. It's in manuscripts. It's the Muhammad, not the Muhammad. The Muhammad. Who is the Muhammad? Well, St. Ambrose will tell you that in the 4th century. Muhammad is the anointed one. That's what it means in Arabic. In Hebrew and in Aramaic. Remember, Arabic is just derived from Aramaic. It's a very new language. In the 7th century, you only had 16 letters. So it was just wasn't really used in written form yet. It was so crude and it certainly had no vowels yet. The vowels were only added in the 8th and 9th century. We're talking about the 7th century when this man supposedly lived. Well, if this man lived there, then he should have a name. They should have written about it. And there's lots of reference to Muhammad. Muhammad's all over the place. It's on coins. Muawiyah puts it on the back of his coin. He has his image on the front of his coins. He's holding a cross. He has a cross above his head, and he has a cross in his hand. What does that suggest? Is Muawiyah a Muslim or a Christian?
That would be a Christian.
Absolutely. You wouldn't be a Muslim if you're holding crosses, and yet he is the first of the Umayyad Caliphate, and he's up there in Damascus. Obviously, he should be down in Medina if he was a Muslim. But there are no Muslims, and there's nothing down in Medina. It's only a hamlet of 200 people. How can you rule an empire with just 200 people? Mecca had yet to be invented. There was no Mecca that early. So you can see a real problem with there. So he's got there on the front of the coin. When you look at the back side of the coin, there's the letter M because it's 40. That's in the denomination 40. There's another cross above the 40. And then right under the letter is Mim Ha Mim Dal. Muhammad. Who do you think the Muhammad is? Muhammad is Jesus Christ, the Anointed One. It's a title. It's not a name. It's always been a title. It's in your Bible. It's in Song of Solomon 5:16, where Solomon says, "O daughters of Jerusalem, the altogether lovely one, the Muhammad." There it is in Hebrew. Muhammad. Mimha Mindal. It's the same 4 letters. It's the Anointed One. You find it 11 times in the Old Testament. All the way through, it is always the Anointed One. So by the 4th century AD, Saint Ambrose says, wait a minute, who is the Muhammad? Who is the Anointed One? The Anointed One is the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So the Muhammad became the Messiah. That's why Muawiyah is putting it on his coin and slapping up there. And we have that coin today. I've got it right here in my drawer. And we're grabbing it up and trying to get as many as possible because we don't want the Muslims to melt these down once they realize that this is not Muhammad, this is Jesus Christ. And this is why you need, if you're going to talk about Muhammad, at least ask the question, where is he in the 7th century? Now, what Muslims will tell you, he's down in Mecca and Medina. That's why you can't find him. He's not up there in Damascus. Bingo. Well, okay, let's go down to Mecca and Medina, which is called the Hijaz. It is known as the central part of Arabia. Have you ever looked at a map lately and notice where Mecca and Medina are? They're in a desert. If they're in a desert, do you have civilizations that grow in deserts? No, you don't. No. Why? Because in order to have civilization, you need water. Without water, no food. Without no food, no people. No people, no towns. No towns, no cities. No cities, no civilization. No civilizations, no currency. No currency, no trade. If there's no water, there's not going to be any coins or trade or any people. And there's not going to be any civilizations. That's why we can't find any reference to the city called Mecca at all. At all. If this is where Muhammad was born in 570, if he starts receiving revelations there in 610, and then moves from there in 622 and moves up to a place called Medina and lives there for the last 10 years of his life in Medina, then certainly someone somewhere should have known about this city, don't you think?
Yep.
According to chapter 7 of the Quran, it is where Adam and Eve were thrown down to when they were thrown out of the Garden of Heaven up in space. They were thrown down to Mecca. So it's the oldest place in history. There is nobody before Adam and Eve. So it should be, if it's the oldest, someone should have known about it, right?
Yeah.
In chapter 21 of the Quran, you have Abraham in Mecca. It's called the Masjid al-Haram. So it's not really called Mecca. It's called the place of a forbidden place of bowing. But there he is. And what is he doing? He is rebuilding the Kaaba. It doesn't use the word Kaaba. It's just Masjid al-Haram. He's rebuilding it. So he's living in 1900 BC. If he's there in Mecca, and Abraham is living in Mecca, then it's a pretty famous place. In fact, it's fascinating to me because I had no idea Abraham lived that far south. Therefore, someone in the Bible should have known about it. There's no reference to Mecca anywhere in the Bible, is there?
No.
In fact, Dr. Patricia Corona, who was head of department first at Oxford University, and then she was moved, she got death threats for writing a book called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam in 1987, so she moved up to Cambridge. That's where I got to know her, and she was my supervisor when I started my doctorate. She wrote and she did a whole study on Mecca. She wrote a whole book on it. Now, this woman reads and writes 15 languages. Can you read and write 15 languages, Sam?
No.
Do you know of anybody that can read and write 15 languages?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Pretty prodigious ability, right? So she
Yes.
could read all the these aren't modern languages. We're talking about archaic languages. So she could read
That's even harder.
which are even more difficult because they're not spoken anymore. Akkadian, Nabatean Aramaic, Syro-Aramaic. She knew, of course, Arabic. She can read and write the she can read and write from the Hamrat regions of the southern Hadramaut area in the southern, southern Arabia. She could read, of course, Greek. She could read Hebrew. She could read all of these Mesopotamian languages. And so she decided to do a study looking to see if she could find any reference to the city called Mecca, which Muhammad supposedly was born and lived at until for at least 40 years, 50 years, because he was in 22 that he moved. So he was 50 years old at that time. She couldn't find any reference. She went to the Himrites, no reference. She went to the Khazarites, no reference. She went to the Assyrians. She went to the Romans. She went to the Persian area. She went to the Nabateans, no reference. She went to the Nubians, which are across the Red Sea in Africa, not one reference to any place called Mecca at all. Oh, lots of other places that are very small and insignificant close to Mecca. Like she found references to Aden and Sana and Najran and Taif and Yathrib. She found references to Yathrib, which is now Medina today, and Khaybar and Tabuk and Gaza. All of these places she found references to, which are insignificant in comparison to what Mecca should be. Not one reference to Mecca. Not one reference to Mecca until 741 AD. Muhammad died in 632. 741 is over 100 years afterwards. Is that not a problem for you?
Yeah.
Bingo.
100%.
Can you see then why, if Muslims are going to claim that Muhammad is the greatest prophet in the history of mankind, if he is the seal of all the prophets, if he is in history, as you've just unquoted, that he is completely supported by everything we know about historical record, then they're going to have to show me where this man lived and where this man came from. They're going to have to first prove two things to me. Where is this man and where is this place? The book and the place. I mean, the man and the place. Show me the man and the place, and then I'll believe you. But you've got to show me from the place and where this man and where this place existed. You've got to show me from the century it happened. You've got to show me from the 7th century or before, because Mecca's been there since the time of Adam. It should be well documented if it's existed long before 7th century, or right back to the very beginning of time. Can you see why Muslims have an awful lot to prove to us? Thank God I don't have to defend this. Now, just put it on the other foot. As Christians, we were asked the same question, were we not? Was there a person called Jesus Christ? Yes, we did. Found his name. His name was not just in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or in the New Testament. We find his name on Thallus and Phlegon, who were debating about his death within 52 AD. That's 20 years after Christ's death. They're having a debate about his death. Within 20 years of his death, these Jewish satirists were debating that when he died, the earth shook and the sun went dark. So you have Greek satirists who knew he lived. You have Josephus, who is a historian, a Jewish historian living in Rome, who not only talks about Jesus and his death, he also talks about the death of his brother James, and refers to this man and says that the Christians believe he rose from the dead. So there is a Jewish reference to Jesus within the first 100 years of his death. And then you have Tacitus. Look at Tacitus. Tacitus is probably the best response. Why? Because he hated Christianity. He had nothing good to say about Christianity. He had no axe to grind. He would not have a bias. In fact, the bias would be, if anything, hostile. He would be a hostile witness. Yet he talks about Jesus. He refers to his death. He even tells us when it happens, that it happens at the time of Pontius Pilate, under the authority of Tiberius. That's why we know it's in 33 AD, because of Tacitus. So there's Roman, there's Greek, and there's Jewish reference points outside of the Bible, all hostile witnesses who support the historicity of Jesus and the crucifixion. That's all I need, is I need outside evidence. What does Islam have against the crucifixion? Because the Muslims don't believe in the crucifixion. They don't believe it ever happened. According to chapter 4, verse 75, or according to 4, and let me get it right. Let me get the right reference on this, because it's been a while since I've quoted this. Let me just get the right reference. It's in chapter 4. Do you know it off the top of your head?
Surah 4, 120 something?
127. Let me get it right, because I don't want to get people off on this. 157. And because they saying, we killed Messiah, son of Maryam, the messenger of Allah, but they killed him not, nor crucified him. That's chapter 4, verse 157. That's the only verse in the entire Quran that confronts the crucifixion. So he never died. He was never on the cross. Another was given his image, is what they say. And that man died in his place. And that's why everybody was duped. What about the man on the cross? Why didn't he say anything? And what did the man on the cross say? Look at the 7 things he said on the cross.
Yeah.
Father,
well, he said, Yeah, and behold
But
your
they know not what they do.
yeah, behold your mother. Yeah, hands over
Saying
his
to
mother.
John
That
about
sort of
Mary,
thing.
it was not John and Mary at the foot of the cross.
Hmm.
Do you think John would not have known who that person was on the cross?
Hmm.
What about the mother? Don't you think a mother would know her own child?
Yep.
I mean, just think the incredulity of Muslims that say that was not Jesus, that was someone else that was given that image. To say nothing of the
Yeah.
man on the cross, he would have said he was not the right man.
Hmm.
But
Well, they think it was. I've heard arguments saying it was Simon of Cyrene who was swapped out.
even
Christ
Simon
or something
Cyrene
like
would have said something. And how could Simon Cyrene be there and Mary not know it?
Hmm.
Or what about Jesus coming 3 days later and appearing in the upper room and showing the holes in his hands and his feet? Or to Thomas a week later and saying, look at the holes in my hands and feet, proving that it was him. What kind of prophet would lie like that? Not my Jesus. So you can see over and over again, every time you try to change the historical record, you're just digging a deeper hole for yourself. That's why it's so good that we don't have this problem. They have a problem with Muhammad. And so, we know who Jesus was. We know when he came. We know that he did exist. We know that he did die. And of course, the rest of us know that he rose again. What I want to hear Muslims say is, do they know that Muhammad even exists? Something as simple as that. I'm not asking them all the records of his life. I'm just asking him two questions. Prove to me that there was a man named Muhammad in the 7th century who received a book called the Quran and lived in a place called Mecca. The book, the man, and the place. That's what I want them to prove, those three. One book, one man, and one place in the 7th century. That shouldn't be too hard.
We could do it with Christ.
We do it. We've been asked to do it. We've had to do it for 200 years, and we have been able to answer every one of those. So I want Muslims now to do the same thing. Can you see why they refuse to do so? How would you do it? I mean, I wouldn't know. I'm glad I'm not in their place. I'm glad I don't have to answer this question. And I'm glad that we have this already nicely solidified because of who our man is and who Jesus Christ is. And more than that, because of the fact that we've done our homework. We have gone back and done our homework. And because of the fact that we can therefore stipulate and say very clearly, we know who Jesus is. We know why he came. We know what he did. We know that he died. And we know that he rose again. And we don't even have to say that, even though our books do say that. There's others who saw it happen outside of him. So he is hammered down in history.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to sort of just get this straight. So I make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. Are you saying that there are no outside sources outside of Islam that can confirm that Muhammad was a real person?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying.
This just blow my mind. Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Awesome.
So what that means, Sam, is that Muslims or anybody who's going to have to try to support this. Now, there is a book that was written by Robert Hoyland in 1999, Islam as Others Sought, where he went and he also reads and writes about 18 languages. Was a professor there in Oxford University, still living. And when he wrote this book, this came out and it showed all the references to what he thought were Islam. But what he did, every time he saw the word MHMD, he put Muhammad there. Now, as a historian, as a linguist, he did us all a disservice. And I thought for sure that these are all Muhammad. I just assumed. But what he didn't know and what we didn't know and what we now know is there were no vowels. So what was he doing? Why didn't he just read the text that he was reading? Why didn't he just read the Arabic and say, why did he put Muhammad when there was no Muhammad? It was Mahmud all the time. So all these references that Muslims are coming up with, and that also many scholars are coming up with, suggesting Muhammad was well known, was well documented from other sources. There's nothing from the Mecca, from Arabia. There's nothing at all from Arabia because there was no people that were writing that far south. There just were no people living that far south in Mecca. So all these writings are coming from what is today Iraq and Syria, Jordan and Lebanon, and to further little east, what is today Iran. That's where all the writings are coming from. And the reason that all these writings are coming from way up there is because there's water up there. Where there's water, there are food. Where there's food, there are people. It's as simple as that. It comes down to water. And since there's no water down further south, that's why we don't expect any writings, and there aren't any writings. So everything that Muslims are dependent on to find out about their man Muhammad are references to Muhammad, not Muhammad. And they have been told, and they've been told by the Westerners, this is Muhammad. What a disservice. We would never do that with the word like Yahweh, 4 letters again. Yahweh. Is that Yahweh or is that Jehovah? Depends on which way you want to, where you put the vowels in, because Hebrew didn't have vowels either. It does now. And so that's why in the same context, Islam, Arabic, we need to be careful. We need to read the writing that is there and not impose our agenda onto those writings.
Wow. My mind is blown, Jay. Honestly, my mind's blown. It really genuinely is. I can't believe that we don't, that this isn't like well known enough.
Well, it's going to start, and listen, it's just now getting into, and a lot of this is well known in Germany, in scholarship in Germany, but they didn't want really the world to know this. They've been known about a lot of this since 1920, so over 100 years. They've kept it in German. They didn't want it to get into English because you can see the ramifications if this gets out into the open. What will this do to Islam? It's as if I was telling you today that I can prove that there was no place called Jerusalem at all in the first century. There was no person called Jesus in the first century, and that that the New Testament as we know it today, and the people who wrote the New Testament all lived up in Turkey or even further north than that, and that they wrote all their material 400 to 600 to 700 years later and redacted it back to the first century, creating a city called Jerusalem that never existed at that period, but only came into existence in the second century. What would you do as a Christian if I were to be able to prove that? That's basically what I'm saying about Islam. How would you defend or even define? How would you even remain a Christian if you could not, if there was nobody named Jesus, there was no city called Jerusalem, and that the New Testament and everything we know about this man Jesus was only first put together 400 years after he lived?
Yeah. Well, that brings to mind 1 Corinthians 15 verses 13 to 19, when Paul's talking about, if Christ didn't rise, all of our faith is in vain.
Bingo.
We've got no reason to believe if the crucifixion, if the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is a lie, we've got no point in being Christians. It's all based on fabric.
I'm saying there was no Jesus, so how could he have died and rose to begin anyways? There is no Jesus. That's basically what I'm saying about Islam. This is even worse than that, because I'm saying that Jesus never existed, then how could he have died and rose? There was no crucifixion. There was no resurrection. Takes that off the table.
Yep. So, I mean, Tori in the chat here has raised an interesting point. Tori said, so why create a fake biography for an imaginary person? What was the motivation to create such a huge lie?
Yeah, and this is the next step that we're putting together now. Obviously, we need to ask and say what's going on, and to do that, we need to look and see what was happening in the 7th century, because there is a historical record that is in the 7th century, and that's what we're now putting. Now we're putting together a book on this whole thing, and that's going to be the last chapter. And I'm just saying this now as of January 2025. It might all change by the time we get the book out. So put this down, put a date, and look at to see that this is what we think is happening. And what we now know is that what was happening is that there were no Muslims. There's no reference to any people called Muslims in the 7th century. There's no reference to a religion called Islam in the 7th century. There is no reference to people known as the age of ignorance, the Jahiliyyah that Islam always talks about. There is no Jahiliyyah. The word even Jahiliyyah had nothing to do with the people. It had to do with your inner, that you are Jahiliyyah in your heart, that you are unbelieving. This is the period before you can't believe. Jahili means unbelief. So it's the period of each individual before they finally believe. But all we know from the 7th century is that there were very strong religious doctrines. And there were the Byzantine Empire, which was strongly Christian, and it was Monophysite. So it was Trinitarian Christianity. And then you have the Nestorians, but then you had the Zoroastrians, who were Persians, the Persians who were Zoroastrian, who were not Christians. And those are the two major powers that existed in that part of the world. The Arabs were then controlled by the Persians. So the places of what is today Iran and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon today in Israel, those were the Nabateans lived. The Nabateans are the precursors to who became the Umayyads. The Umayyads were the Nabatean Empire. They were Arabs. They were also Christians, but they saw their lineage back through Ishmael to Hagar, whereas the Christians and the Jews saw their lineage back to Abraham through Isaac. So they both trace their lineage back to Isaac, back to Abraham, one through their lineage through Isaac, one through Ishmael. So they call themselves Hagarenes. And this is well known. The Nabateans were Hagarene, or they were Ishmaelites, or so in the line of Ishmael, in the line of Hagar, or they call themselves Muhajirun, people. Mu means people, Un is plural, the people of Hagar. And that's what Muhajirun means. Or they call themselves Hagre, the place of Hagar. That's the place, meaning Jordan today. That's where Petra, where their capital was. So the Nabateans were Petrans. Now, when in 622, you had the Byzantines, Heraclius, the emperor, come and destroy the Sassanians, who were the Persians. They destroyed their empire, which meant that whole area suddenly went into a vacuum, because then Heraclius went back to the west, because he had too many problems that he had to deal with in the west. So he left that part of the world, what is the Mesopotamia, the land of the two rivers, basically in a vacuum, and little city-states started growing up, and they started controlling themselves. And it wasn't until Muawiyah finally brought them all together and created the first caliphate, known as the Umayyad Caliphate. Now his stories start weakening. This is all documented in history. But look and see who Muawiyah was. I just told you who he was because we look at the coins to see who he was. Who was he? You told me about half an hour ago.
Jesus.
No, he was a Christian. Jesus.
Yeah, he was Christian. Yes, that's all right. Yes, sorry.
He had a cross. He was in another cross, and he had a cross above his
head.
That's
it, yep.
A strong Christian. He would be a Trinitarian Christian. That's why you have three crosses. And then on the backside, he had Muhammad, the anointed one, which is the title for Jesus, showing that he was under the tutelage of Jesus. So that's all he is given credit for, the title of Jesus. So he would have been a strong Christian. And he controlled from 661 to 680. So for the first 20 years was under his tutelage, was under his authority. By 680, then, the Marwan family, which was not part of the Sufyani family, they're both Umayyads, they had come up from way up in the east. And they had come now from the east, and they had come down, and they then took over and threw out the Sufyani family and took over hegemony there in Damascus. Now, Marwan himself didn't last very long, but his son did. His son was named Abdul Malik. Have you heard that word before? Abdul Malik, that name.
It rings a bell, yes.
Abdul Malik is the greatest of all the Umayyad caliphates. He was in power from 685 to 705. And it was he that created really the Arab hegemony. He was the one that made Arabic the lingua franca for the whole world of his underpower. And he controlled from Spain in the west all the way to India in the east, from Turkey in the north all the way to Yemen in the south. So he had the second biggest superpower of his day. The only other superpower would be the Byzantines, who were Trinitarian Christian. What does he do when he comes to power? Well, the first thing he does is he goes down to Jerusalem, which is the head of the Christian and Jewish religion. It's where all the pilgrims went to, and the Jews went to Mount Moriah. And the Christians went to Church of the Sepulchre, just looking below Mount Moriah. And that's where all the pilgrims went. And that's where the temple is going to be rebuilt. That's where the Muhammad is going to return. Here's the word Muhammad again, right? Everybody's waiting for the Muhammad. Not only the Christians, the Jews are waiting for the Muhammad, because it's the same word in Hebrew. They're waiting for the Messiah to return as well. In Arabic, Muhammad. And so what does he do? He goes there in 691 and builds the greatest superstructure of his day, known as the Dome of the Rock. It's still there today. It sits right there on Mount Moriah, where the Muhammad's going to return. They're all waiting for the Muhammad to return there. But it's not a mosque. It has no Qibla. It's not facing Mecca today. Even today, there is no Qibla facing Mecca. This predates the Qibla. So what does he do? He writes inscriptions. And look at the inscriptions. They're still there today. It's the only part of the building that's still original. All the rest has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. But the two ambulatories right in the middle are still the original part of the structure. And the inscriptions are still there in Arabic. And they're in consonantal text. There is no vowelization, because vowelization had not been created, not in the 7th century. And just read it. It's all attacking the divinity of Jesus. Say not three, for God is one, and he has no son. Who's that attacking? It's attacking the Trinity, it's attacking Jesus' divinity, and it's attacking his sonship, right? Have you heard this before?
Yes. Yeah, I think so,
The Jehovah's Witnesses are saying that. The Ebionites said that. The Arians said that. This has been an attack against Christianity since almost the very beginning. In the 2nd century, the Ebionites were attacking Jesus' divinity. They were attacking the Trinity. The Arius is the one that attacked the Trinity and Jesus' divinity. That's why you have the Council of Nicaea. That's why Athanasius was commissioned to shut down Arianism in the 4th century. Now we're in the 7th century, and here comes not just a bishop and not just a small group. Here comes the greatest caliph of the entire Umayyad Caliphate. He is an anti-Trinitarian Christian. He is an Arian. He doesn't call himself an Arian. But what does he do? He's attacking Jesus, his divinity. He's attacking the Trinity. He's attacking the sonship. And then it says, for God does not begetteth, nor is he begotten. He's attacking John 3:16. He's attacking the fact that God can have a son. And then look and see what it says next. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. For there is only one God but God. And the Muhammad, not Muhammad, there's no vowels there. It's MHMD, Mimha Mimdal. Just read it. The Muhammad is the servant of God. He's nothing more than the messenger. That's what Rasul means, the messenger. He is not God. He is not part of the Trinity. This is an anti-Trinitarian attack against Trinitarian Christianity, against the Byzantines. That's what's there on the Dome of the Rock. He then issues coins. He mints coins the same year. Now, he's under tribute to the Byzantines because the Byzantines control that part of the Umayyads have their own hegemony, but they still have to pay tribute every year to the Byzantines. Now, what does he do? He takes a coin, a Byzantine coin, and we've got it. A solidus, a beautiful gold solidus, which has a picture of Heraclius and his 2 sons on either side holding orbs with crosses on them. And on the back side is a Byzantine cross. And he takes that coin to pay tribute, but he remints it. And he puts Heraclius and his 2 sons, and they're holding an orb, but he takes the cross off. And on the backside, he takes off the cross piece. It's a mockery of the Byzantine cross. He's mocking Byzantine Christianity. And he sends that as tribute to Justinian II, who is now the emperor of the Byzantine emperor. Justinian II gets angry. Everybody else gets angry. He goes to war against Abd al-Malik. Abd al-Malik wins the war. And what does Abd al-Malik do next? Just follow the coins. You just need to follow the coins. He then remints a brand new coin in 693. See, this all happens in 691, and the Dome of the Rock is finished in 691. A mockery of Jesus Christ. Not a mockery, basically an anti-Trinitarian attack. It's a polemic against Jesus as his Trinity and his divinity. And then he introduced a brand new coin. I've got it right here, and it's a picture of himself. So here he is. How can he be a Muslim and be putting an image of himself on the coin? And he has a cross. This is a victory coin. And he puts the Shahada around the outside. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. There is only one God but God, and the Muhammad, the praised one, the anointed one, is the messenger of God. He is not God. And then by 696, he scraps all his coins and remints his final coin. And this has reference. It's all script. There's no image anymore. And front and back, I've got it here in my drawer. And there he attacks Jesus. He attacks the Trinity. Everything that he has on the Dome of the Rock, he has on that coin. And then he talks about the muhajirun, mushrikuns, the mushrikuns, those who are the associators. You associators, we're going to kill you associators. What's an associator? It's someone that associates another with God, committing shirk. That's what shirk means, to commit another God. We are the associators because we've elevated Jesus to the status of God. It's all against us. It's all against Jesus. It's all against the Trinity. It's all against his divinity. So it is an anti-Trinitarian attack against the Trinity done by a caliph. He's not a Muslim. There's nothing there called a Muslim. Then you have John of Damascus. John of Damascus is watching this. He's right there in the courts of Damascus. He is there as the treasurer for Abd al-Malik. He is a Christian. He is a Trinitarian Christian. Very well-known father. He sees this all happening. He finally retires, goes into a monastery, and he writes his great masterpiece. Look and see the title of that masterpiece. Written, and look at the date, 730. This is 100 years after, if Muhammad had existed, it's 100 years later, he writes this book, and look at the title, The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. Why don't we just read what's on the ground? Read what's in the text. It's a heresy. In order to be a heresy, it has to be a heresy of something. That means it has to be a heresy of Christianity, right? And the Ishmaelites, it's the heresy of the Arabs, the Ishmaelites, the Muhajiruns, the Hagarites, the Hagarines. It is their heresy. This is the new heresy. And he, as a Christian, a Trinitarian, he then looks and read what he writes. He talks about this Muhammad. You now have a Muhammad, this evil prophet. So now Muhammad, the third Muhammad, not the Jewish Muhammad, not the Christian Muhammad, the Ishmaelite Muhammad. This is the third one. Now they're now creating him as their prophet because they don't have it. Now remember, they own the land from Spain to India, from Turkey to Yemen. They are now the greatest superpower of their day. The one thing they don't have that the Christians and Jews have is they don't have a prophetic line like the Christians and Jews have. They don't have scripture like the Christians and Jews have. They're cousins. So what do? You've got to create your own prophet. Who do you do it with? Well, you do it what everybody's waiting for. You say you're waiting for the Muhammad, you're waiting for the anointed one. We've got the Muhammad. But see, they don't say Muhammad because, see, here's the great thing about John of Damascus. He doesn't write in Arabic. He writes in Greek. And Greek has vowels. Just read the Muhammad. It's Mahmed, M-A-H-M-E-T. It's Mahmed. He even pronounces it. It's not Muhammad. There's no Muhammad there. It's Mahmed. It's the same Mahmed that the Greeks, the Jews, and the Christians are waiting for. But now the Ishmaelites have that Mahmed. And then he says this Mahmed, this evil man who has ridiculous doctrines, and he has the book of the women. The book of the cow. Oh, wait a minute. Isn't that Surah 2 now in the Quran today? And then he has the book of the women. Hold a minute. Isn't that Surah 4 in the Quran today? Hey, look at the balloons going up. And then he has the book of the table. Isn't that Surah 5 in the Quran? And then he has the book of the camel. Hold on a minute. There is no book of the camel in the Quran. But this is not the Quran. These are three surahs, three books. Surah means book in Arabic. These are three books that eventually become the Quran. So which means there is no Quran this early. And we're talking about 730, well into the 8th century, proving that even the Quran didn't exist this early. But it had 3 of the 4 books that we now know about today, and another 112 books. 111, because there's 114 of these books that have been added later on. But this is well into the 8th century, and the Quran's still not finished. So just read what's writing on the ground. Now, of course, this is not Islam yet. It's still anti-Trinitarian Christianity. He still would consider himself a Christian, like Jews. Just like the Jehovah's Witnesses would consider themselves Christians today. They'd be the first to say they're the true Christians. And he would have called himself a true Christian. But John of Damascus knows they're not. He knows that this is a heresy. As we would say, Jehovah's Witnesses would be heretics today. So when did Islam then come into being? Answer the question that the man asked. This happened during the Abbasid period. And it's the Abbasids who then come to power in 749. About 20 years after John of Damascus wrote his masterpiece. The Abbasids come together, and they are Persian. They are not Arabs. Their headquarters is in Ctesiphon, which is now Baghdad today, but Ctesiphon back then. And they then take over, destroy the Umayyads. They want nothing to do with the Umayyads, and they destroy all their documentation. Now can you see why we know nothing that's happening in the 7th century? It's all been destroyed. They then are the ones that choose Mecca, because they don't want to use Jerusalem, because Jerusalem has all the history that they don't want. And that's why all the mosques are facing Jerusalem and they're facing Petra before 749. After 749, all the mosques, now their qiblas now start facing Mecca. Isn't that interesting? So just look at the coins, look at the inscriptions, and look at the buildings, and they all tell the story. But see, those are the only things that still exist today. You can't destroy coins, you can't destroy rock inscriptions, and you can't destroy buildings. You can destroy documents. So almost everything we know about Islam today, the Muhammad we know about today, is introduced by the Abbasids. But the Abbasids have lots of things that are going wrong, and they don't really they've got the place, Mecca, but then what do? In order to make Mecca like Jerusalem, you just design it like Jerusalem. Have you noticed that everything that happens in Mecca happened in Jerusalem earlier? Go to Mecca. Well, you can't have, obviously, but you've seen pictures. What do Muslims do? They go to a square building called the Kaaba. Kaaba means cube in Arabic. It also means cube in Hebrew. And what do? They circumambulate 7 times going around the Kaaba, going counterclockwise. Who do you think did that earlier? The Jews. And where did they do that? Where was the Kaaba in Judaism?
Be the temple.
Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. is where they always went for their pilgrimage. And why would they circumambulate 7 times counterclockwise? Because of Jericho. The Jews were always, they circumambulated 7 times around Jericho, and then the walls fell down. That's why the Jews still today, up until the 1st century, 70 AD, they were still circumambulating around the Kaaba there in Jerusalem. That's been replaced almost exactly in Jerusalem today. Then what do they do next? Every Muslim will tell you what they do next. They run back and forth between 2 mountains called Marwa and Safa. Marwa and Safa. Look and see where those mountains are. They're only about 100 yards away from the Kaaba. They're right next to the Kaaba. And then there's a Zamzam well in between to commemorate Hagar looking for water for Ishmael. Hagar, she's been thrown out into the desert, right? Well, she was living in Mecca, according to the traditions. She was living in Mecca with Abraham, and then Abraham throws her out of Mecca and throws her out into the desert. So she's way out in the desert, and she runs out of water. So she's running back and forth. She first goes to Marwa, which is a mountain, can't find water, then goes to Safa and does it 7 times. There's the number 7 again, the perfect number. Comes back to where Ishmael, and there's the water burbling out of the ground, the Zamzam water, known as the Zamzam well today. Now stop and look and see where those are. They're not way out in the desert. They're just 100 yards away from the Kaaba. If she had been thrown out in the desert looking for water, she was still in Mecca. She could have gone to the nearest house, which is surrounding, and just knocked on the nearest door and got water. Obviously, these are not the original Marwa and Safa, are they? No, these are nothing more than facsimiles. Go and look at pictures of them. Google it after I get off and look at pictures of Marwa and Safa. They're just 2 rocks 20 feet high. That's not a mountain. Kids can climb on it. And they run back and forth between these 2 rocks to commemorate what? You have to go to the original Marwa. And where is the original Safa? Jerusalem. Mount Moriah in Arabic is Marwa. All the Jews went to Mount Moriah. Then they went down from Mount Moriah, which is a mountain. It's up on a mountain. That's why it's called Mount Moriah. They go down to the Kidron Valley. Then they come back up to Mount Scopus. Mount Scopus, according to Josephus in Arabic, is Safa. There is the Marwa and Safa. The original Marwa and Safa are there in Jerusalem. So that makes sense because they are mountains. So everything they've just taken from Jerusalem and they made it into a smaller facsimile. That's what you do when you want to reproduce what was the original. Listen, you can go to Las Vegas today and you will see an Eiffel Tower there and you'll see a pyramid. Those are not the original Eiffel Tower, nor the original pyramid, but it's a great place for people to go to. And it's what you do for entertainment. And you do it whenever there's a sanctuary or if there's a place like Disney World or Disneyland or Dubai today. You go there and you go there to get enough so people will pay an awful lot of money to do the rituals. So that is exactly what Mecca became. It became a reproduction, a facsimile of the original Jerusalem. So that's why the people then, when you ask, well, then why once they now have their prophet, of course, the prophet has to have a book. That's why you see suddenly, how do you put together a book? You've got to find writings. So where do you go to? Well, you start grabbing everything you can get and you go to the Jews. And the problem is the Jews had not taken their scriptures and translated into Arabic yet. That wasn't done until the 9th century. So you take what the Jews have. Notice what the Jews have. They have all these folk tales about Abraham, about Solomon, about Moses. These are folk tales that are written in the vernacular, and basically they are children's stories for bedtime stories. So you can look and see the Quran is full of these stories. They're nothing to do with the same stories of Abraham or Solomon. I mean, look at the story of Solomon in chapter 27. He's marching some birds, getting them ready for battle, and then he lets them fly up above the enemy, and they drop the stone on the enemy with the name of the enemy below it. That's not in your Bible. I had no idea that Solomon marched birds. And one day he was marching the birds and the hoopoe bird was missing, his favorite bird. He gets so angry until he sees the hoopoe bird flying towards him, lands at his feet, and starts talking to him. I had no idea that Solomon could talk to birds, but according to the Quran, he can. And he said, where have you been? He says, well, I went way in the south to a place called Sheba, and I saw this gorgeous queen. And Solomon said, well, bring her up to me. So it flaps on back down to Sheba and brings his queen up, and she comes up. Oh, evidently, she talks to birds too. I guess they could do that in 1900 BC, or when is it? 1000 BC, sorry. Now she comes, and now she's coming across the room there where the throne room is, and as she's about to come across, she looks down, she sees a pond there in the middle of the floor. She picks up her skirts to keep them from getting wet. That's in chapter 27 of the Quran, verses 17 to 44. Is that the story that you know of Solomon in your Bible?
No.
So where does it come from?
It sounds like it's been taken from a Disney cartoon.
It doesn't, isn't it? I wish I'd had
Yeah.
that. That'd be a great Disney cartoon. It comes from the second Talmud of Esther, which is an apocryphal writing, a Jewish apocryphal writing written as a bedtime tale for children, written in the 2nd century AD. But it was written and therefore translated into Arabic. So that's the only material they had. That's why almost all of this material about the Old Testament prophets and about Jesus himself, look at the references to Isa. He makes birds out of clay and then blows them and they fly up into the air. I didn't remember Jesus doing that. He bends down in chapter 19 a palm tree so his mother can eat. I didn't remember that Jesus as a baby bent down palm tree so his mother could eat. That comes in the second, the Gospel of Tom, the second book of the apocryphal books of the I'm getting the wrong now here. It comes from, anyway, it's a Gnostic account written about the childhood of Jesus, written in the 2nd century. And these are all Gnostic writings. They're all written as much later from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. Nothing to do with Jesus's adulthood. It's all to do with Jesus's childhood. And yet you find these stories in the Quran. They just borrowed right and left. That's why when you look at the Quran, it's all over the place. There's no sequence. There's no chronology. There's only one complete story in the entire Quran, and that's in chapter 12. Everything's just ulta pulta, goes all over the place. That's what you do when you borrow. Now, once you have a book and you're starting to put it together, and as John of Damascus said, there were only really 3 books or 4 books by 730. That's why we can't find any manuscripts. We can't find any Quranic manuscripts that all predate the 8th century. And the ones we can find, we're not even sure of the dates on them because we cannot forensically test them, because you cannot test writing. You can only test the date of the paper itself with carbon dating. You cannot test the ink. That's why we don't know when they were written on. What is important is that when you finally get the man and you finally get his book, then you got to give him a backstory. That's why when you start putting the backstory together, you get revision after revision after revision. Now, I'm not saying that there was no one named Ibn Hisham who wrote something in 833. There probably was someone named Ibn Hisham. But what he wrote, we don't have today. It was then revised and revised and revised until it was finally written down. Let me just get this up here. The first manuscript we have that Wüstenfeld used for Ibn Hisham, the first one we have is not till, let me get it here. Is not till 1063. That's the Fez document, the Fez manuscript. And according to what Wüstenfeld said, he only used 25% of that. He threw 75% away because he didn't trust it. And then he went to another document that was written in 1200, another document that was written in 1300, another document that was written in 1300, another from 1400, and then finally the one that he took Morse from was written in 1500. That's the 16th century. And he took these 6 documents, amalgamated them together, and then gave us the story of Muhammad in the 18th century. 1860. So that's 19th century. Sorry. So can you see? It took 1,200 years to finally got this written together, but it was created not by the Abbasids. It's interesting. What we now have today had nothing to do with the Abbasids, because once you get into 1100 and once you get into 13, 14, and 1600, you're talking about the Ottoman period. So these are Ottoman documents that have been revised and revised and revised and revised, and then finally put together by a German scholar in Berlin in the 19th century. So what is and how did Islam begin? That we have yet to find out, because this, just what I've told you today, we're going to have to revise everything. We're going to have to then ask, when did actually the Islam that we have today, when did it finally come together? I mean, you know this problem already with the Quran. You know that in the Quran, we don't have any manuscript at all from the 7th century. And the ones we have from the 8th century are not complete. They don't agree with each other. We're not even sure they're from the 8th century. We're just guessing they're from the 8th century and the 9th century. So when did the Quran finally get finalized? Well, we don't even know that, because all we can look at is the consonantal text. That's all we can look at. But what about all the dots and the vowels? The 5 dots and the 3 vowels that were added to make a na, ta, tha, ba, ya, and then also a dama, u, a fata, a, and the kasra, e sound. Those were not introduced until the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. And they were not chosen, the first 7 were not chosen until Ibn Mujahid did that in 936. And then another 14 were chosen by Ibn Shatabi in 1294. That's the 13th century. And then finally the last 6 were chosen by Al-Jaziri in 1429. That's the 15th century. So by the 15th century, we have 30 different Qurans. 30 different Qurans, all in Arabic, with over 100,000 differences, 100,000 different words. So what Quran are we talking about? Had to be chosen as one Quran in 1924. That is 100 years ago, by a man named Ibn Walid, Al-Walid, there in Al-Jazeera, in university in Cairo in 1924. And the other 29 had to be taken out into a boat and sunk into the Nile. And we were the ones that discovered the other 29. It was Hatun Tosh, my colleague, who was down in Morocco when she went into a bookstore and just said, could you give me an Arabic Quran? And the man said behind the counter, so which Quran are you talking about? We have Hafs over here. We have Ibn al-Duri over here. We have Warish over here. We have Ibn Kasai over here. She said, well, give me all of them. She came back with 6 of them back to London. I started laughing when I saw she had these 6. She said, what is going on here, Jay? He said that these are all Arabic Quran. I said, yes, they are, but no two are alike. I had no idea when she brought them in 2013 to see there in London. I had no idea that you could still get these Qurans. I thought they'd all been destroyed in 1924. How idiotic could I be? That's just for Cairo. They destroyed them. But that meant the whole rest of the Muslim world was still reproducing, and they're still reproducing it today. Look up there. I have 9 of them right up there on the shelf. All of those are all 9 different Qurans. I just bought these off the internet. You can buy them today. No two are alike. They're all in Arabic. They're all original. And so when did the Quran finally get finalized? That we still don't know. But you can see this has all come to the fore since 2016 when we introduced this and held it up there at Speaker's Corner so the whole world could see it. And because of that, it just threw the Quran under the bus. And then, of course, when that famous interview with Muhammad Hijab and Al-Qadi, is that his name?
Yes, Dr. Yasser Qadi.
Yasser Qadi, when they had that interview in 2020, and he asked a simple question. He said, I'm going to put my hand out on which is the Quran that was revealed to Muhammad, which is the eternal Quran that was finally written by Uthman in 652. By that time, that interview, that 28-minute interview just destroyed the Quran. When he finally, after 28 minutes, he says, listen, you're pushing me. We don't talk about this in public. Please don't ask me which Quran is the eternal Quran. And then finally, when Muhammad Hijab insisted, he says, they're all the Quran. A little bit of Kasai, a little bit of Hafs, a little bit of Warish, a little bit Khatun. Just mix them all up and you've got the Quran. And I just started clapping. I was watching that live when that happened in 2020, June 8th, 2020. And I said, boy, Yasser Qadi, you don't know what you've done. You've just thrown the Quran under the bus. And he admitted what he had never admitted before, and that is that he had always said his whole life there's only one Quran. Not one word, not one letter was different. And yet now he was admitting he had no idea that he was talking about 100,000 differences. And these are not just a punctuation or pronunciation differences. These actually change the word. If you change the word, you change the meaning. You change the meaning, you change the doctrine, the theology, in some places the practices. So these were wholesale changes. And that's why it's so good that we have finally asked the same historical question that we've been asking all the time. If you're going to make a claim about any religion, about any man, about any book or any place, which every religion does, we make the same claims about Jesus Christ, then for heaven's sakes, go back to the century when those things existed. If we're going to make claims about Jesus, that he existed and he died on the cross and he rose again, then we have to go back to the 1st century and answer that. If the Muslims are going to make the claim that there was a man named Muhammad who lived in a place called Mecca and moved to Medina in 622 and lived there for the last 10 years and received a book called the Quran during that period in that place with all these disparate theological disputations and all kinds of theological material in a place where there were no Jews and Christians. They didn't live that far south. There were no Christians and Jews that far south. How could he had all these discussions with Christians and Jews when they didn't even exist there? Then you're going to have to show me and prove to me that that book came from that place at that time with that man. That's all I'm asking. We're just asking 3 historical questions. One book, one man, and one place. Prove it from the 7th century, and don't waste my time with the traditions, which don't even come from the 9th and 10th century. They start to appear in the 11th century, and they continue right up into the 16th century. That's 400 to 800 years too late. Thank God we don't have that problem. We don't even have to be held accountable for this. Isn't it great to be able to argue from strength finally?
Yes, exactly. All of this this isn't just catastrophic. This isn't just like you read about something like the Grenfell Tower of like a architectural design. This is nuclear, right? This blows Islam out of the water. on all fronts. You've got the Quran, you've got the history of supposedly Muhammad, you've got the history of the religion itself, the origins of the theology, and in relation to Jerusalem and the Jews and the Christians. This is insane. So
let me just say one more thing, Sam, before you go on. How long have I said? It's taken me about an hour to go through all this, right? Maybe a little bit, an hour and 15 minutes. In the hour and 15 minutes that I've been speaking, have I said anything hateful about Islam?
No.
Have I said anything that's Islamophobic?
No.
Have I mocked Muhammad?
No.
Have I mocked Muslims?
No.
Have I mocked the Quran?
No.
So can you see, everything I have said is absolutely neutral, right? Is anything I said, except for what I talked about Christianity, is anything I said, could not anybody say what I've just said?
Yeah.
You don't have to be a Christian to say what I've just said, right?
No.
An atheist could say this.
Mm-hmm.
A humanist could say this.
Yep.
A Muslim could say this.
Yeah.
So there's nothing in anything I said that has a bias, that has a Christian bias built into it. Right? Mm-hmm. This is a historical critique, which is as neutral as you can get, which means there's no reason for me to get any death threats anymore.
No, there's no reason at all.
I'm not getting any death threats anymore. I'm not getting any strikes from YouTube anymore. I used to get strike after strike because of all this stuff that I was putting up there that was attacking Muhammad, mocking him. And that's all I knew, because that's all I was given until this historical material was just plopped in my hat because of what a course I took at the University of London at School of Oriental and African Studies in 1994 and 1995 by Dr. Gerald Hawting on the origins of Islam. A simple course, 1 year long, on the origins of Islam. And the first thing he said in class was, we don't have any reference to Muhammad at all in the 7th century. We have no biography for 200 years. We have no references to what he said for 240 years. And I had never heard that before. I heard that there at School of Oriental and African Studies by Dr. Gerald Hawting, and it changed my life. That happened, that was over 30 years ago. And that's why what we're saying and what I'm doing today is as neutral as you can get. It is as politically correct as you can get. I could be anybody saying this. There's nothing about, except when I start defending Jesus Christ and I defend and I say like with like and I do a comparison, then you can see that I am a Christian, and I really do want Muslims to get away from the book and get away from that man and get away from that text because of what that book and that man, that text is doing to them. And I want to bring them home. I want to bring him home to Jesus Christ. I want to bring him home to a better book. I want to bring him home to a better man. And I want to bring him home to a better God. Because we've got everything they want. Because they're so close to us. They're so close to us, Sam. They believe in eternal salvation. They believe that there is a God that exists. I love that about them. They believe in revelation like you and I believe in revelation. They believe in sin like you and I believe in sin. They believe in salvation like we believe in salvation. The problem is they just got the wrong book, the wrong book, the wrong man, and the wrong place. And we've got to bring them back to a much bigger book. And see, that's why I want to take them from this book and I want to bring them back to this book. You notice which is the bigger book? This is the bigger book. Mm-hmm. There's a reason why this is a bigger book, because it is the final revelation. It is the universal revelation. I want to bring back to a better man. This book only refers to this man, Muhammad, 4 times. And now we know that 3 of those are Muhammad. They're not Muhammad. They're Muhammad. I want to bring him back to Jesus. This book is all about Jesus Christ. So in the way we're ending this, you can see I'm a Christian. Of course, that's the Christian part of this, because I do want to preach the gospel. And I do believe that the only way to salvation is through Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. And on that, we too agree. And that's why, for me, it is so important that Muslims do hear this. And it's so important that we as Christians, but it doesn't have to be us. It can be humanists and atheists and anybody else, anybody that wants historical veracity for both Christianity and Islam. Ask the same questions. Now, much of what we've done in this last hour, I've used redacted criticism, I've used source criticism, I've used historical criticism, I've used some textual criticism, I've even used some form criticism. These are the same criticisms that were applied against our New Testament and against the Lord Jesus Christ by the Germans there in Tübingen and Wellhausen and others. And so we've had this for 200 years. We've had to deal with these criticisms, but we have answered every one of those criticisms. All I'm asking Muslims is, for heaven's sakes, listen to what we're saying. We're not mocking you. We're not mocking your Bible. I'm sorry, your Quran. We're not mocking Muhammad. There's no reason I want to mock you. Why would I want to mock him when I don't even think he existed? What's there to mock if he didn't even exist? What's there to mock if that book never existed, not when we claim it is? And why in the world would I want to spend 43 years of my life loving you and asking you to come home if I didn't believe in and that you have a better place to come to, a better book, a better man, and a better salvation?
Exactly. Amen. Amen. Amen, Jay. Amen. If you've got time, I'd like to run through two quick questions. So Oscar has asked this question. I have a question for Dave. Does he have a book exposing Islam, or is he planning to write one? I'm willing to buy one if he has written one. God bless. I know you mentioned a book earlier.
Yeah. I'm writing it right now. In fact, Dr. Daniel Janask and I are writing it together, and it's all on this new material. And it's because everybody has been asked this. Oscar, you're not the first. And there are so many people that have been saying, please, can we have a book? Because this is so much material. I've just done a quick myopic overview of it. We are writing the book. It should be out this year, and we're going to be publishing it. We have a publisher already, and we will let you know when it happens. But the problem is, the difficulty is this: as soon as I write it, it's going to be out of date because there's so much new material coming to the fore. And so we're going to say that from the very beginning, just like I've said right now. This is what I think happened in January of 2025. I think in January of 2020, this is where we stand today. That's going to have to change as we get no more material. But that's a good problem. That's not a bad problem, Oscar. So, bear with us. We're going to write the book, and then we're going to have to write supports, and then we're going to have to write different books that take each one of these areas. And what we're going to do, Oscar, we're going to have a whole slew of writings just on Muhammad and what he is and who he is and what we now think he is. We're going to have a whole slew of writings just on Mecca, because that's going to be a whole new genre of research just on that city. And then the biggest, the most important, and probably the most prolific is just on the Quran. There's so much now coming out on the Quran, on the manuscripts, on the variants, on the qira'ats. Each one of those is a book in itself. So there's going to be an entire genre of writings that we're going to create, and we're bringing up a whole slew of students. I have a MAPI program, Master of Arts in Apologetics and Polemics to Islam, and we're starting a new course just on the 27th of January. That's just in about 2 weeks, just on this material that I've introduced today. It's all starting. We have this on Zoom webinar. If any of you want to come and join us on Zoom webinars on the 27th of January, we start every Monday night. Of course, for you in England, it'll be 1 o'clock in the morning, because we start at 8 o'clock at night here in the East Coast. That's 5 hours difference. So it'll be 1 o'clock in the morning. Sorry for that, but we've got to go with the American crown, since they're the main ones of our students. And we have about 300 students that are taking this all over the world because they want this material. But what they're all asking is what you're asking, Oscar. Write it down. Because once you write it down, then you don't have to go through a video. You don't have to know where Jay said this, or where Daniel said this, or where Sam said this. You can just open the book and find the page, and you can quote the material. And also, the great thing about a book is that we have to source everything that's said. So all the footnotes are probably even more valuable than what is written in the page itself, so that you can source it and put it and be able to give authority to it.
Awesome. And the next question, Daniel Apologetics. God bless you, Daniel. Thanks for tuning in. Question: Zayd ibn Thabit was put to get the Quran sent to 5 Muslim-controlled cities till this day. So what's the most common excuse Jay gets from Muslims when asked, so where's your 7th century Quran?
They usually change the subject. And Daniel Apologetics, I know him, and we're good. We're not good friends, but we are friends. Listen, Daniel, you know the answer. Yes, this is tongue-in-cheek. You're asking this question. How would you put yourself in a Muslim's shoes when this question is asked? If this guy, Zayd ibn Thabit, and remember, what is Zayd ibn Thabit? He is the secretary of Muhammad. That means he could read and write. So when Muslims say there was no writing at that time, then what do you think Zayd ibn Thabit was doing? He was a secretary. They write. So obviously the Quran was written down. It was written down first by him under Abu Bakr in 632 to 634, that 2-year period. Now, that was given to Abu Bakr. He gave it to the daughter of who comes after Abu Bakr? Abu Bakr, forget that second caliph. He gives it to the second caliph's daughter, who used to be the wife of Muhammad. Her name was Hafsa, and she stuck it under her bed. What in the world? If this is the only revelation you have for the whole history of mankind, and you stick it under your bed, what's the purpose of that? 20 years later, during the time of Uthman, Then you have, of course, many different Qurans that were existing way up in the north when they had the battle at Azerbaijan. And so that's why they had to rewrite, take that Quran that was there under the bed of Hafsa and rewrite it again and make then 5 copies. And this is what Daniel's talking about. These 5 copies, one was left in Mecca, one was sent to Medina, one was sent to Basra, one was sent to what is today Baghdad, and one was sent up to Damascus. So 2 in Iraq, 1 in Syria, and 2 in what is today Saudi Arabia, or Arabia back then. So there's 5 copies. And why were they sent there? So that then no longer would the Quran ever be corrupted. So they were there as models to be the category for every other Quran that came after. So the simple question that Daniel's asking is, okay, 5 copies, 5 cities. Those 5 cities, look on the map. Have they ever been destroyed? Have there been a flood? Has there been a fire? Has there ever been any conquering of those 5 cities? No, they've been in Muslim control for 1400 years. So there's no excuse for them not to have those 5 copies. I'm just asking for one of them. Even one. Why has not even one survived? Remember, they're written on parchment, on vellum, not on papyrus like our earliest manuscripts are written on. It wasn't until Constantine finally commissioned the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus and the Vaticanus to be commissioned on animal skin parchment. That's the reason why we have them today, the entire manuscript. And that's from 200 to 300 years earlier, because that's from the 4th and 5th century. So Muslims, where is there just one copy? So when you ask them this, they usually change the subject. How would you answer that? See, I don't know how I've never seen a Muslim that can answer. They say, well, we just don't take good care of our manuscripts. That's not an excuse. You can't say that you haven't even one of those 5 manuscripts. Not even one. And the 6 manuscripts you do have, which is the Topkapi manuscript, which is there in Topkapi Museum in Istanbul, that is from the mid-8th century. It's the best manuscript you've got. It's about 99% of the Quran, but it is from the mid-8th to late 8th century. That's 100 years later. The other next one, you have the Samarkand, which is in Uzbekistan, in Tashkent. That one only has 43, goes up to Surah 43. Over half the Quran is missing. And even in those 43 surahs, only one of those surahs is complete. 16 don't even exist in those 43. So you can see, and it's full of grammatical mistakes. Then you have the Husseini manuscript, which is in Cairo. That one is from the 9th century. It is not complete, and it has hundreds and hundreds of manuscript variants. That means variants between the Quran that we have today and that which is in that. And then you've got the one that's right here in London, right there in London, called the 1265 and the 1295 Quran, which is the Ma'il Quran there in the British Library. That only goes up to chapter 43. It's half of the Quran is missing, and it has hundreds of manuscript variants. And then you've got the Petropolitanus manuscript, which is sitting there in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris in France. That is only 23% of the Quran. It is from the mid to late 8th century, and it has 93 manuscript variants. I forgot to tell you that the top copy has 2,190 variants between that book and the Quran we have today. So not one of these Qurans, I forgot the last one, the Sana'a manuscript, the most exciting one, which is from Yemen. That one is the oldest. That is dated to 705. That's the earliest, early 8th century, but even it has thousands of manuscript variants. Not one of these Qurans is complete. Not one of these Qurans supports the other. Not one of these Qurans is exactly like the Quran we have today. There go the balloons again. Proving that even the Qurans you do have are not from the 7th century. They are not any one of these 5 that you're talking about, and they are not the same. They're not even the Qurans that we're looking for. So when is your first Quran, Muslims? Daniel, great question, but you can say this is why Muslims need to answer these questions. They cannot come up with Qurans. If they cannot come up with Qurans, then for heaven's sakes, please stop making the claims that the Qurans go back to Uthman. They don't come back to Uthman.
Brilliant stuff. We have a Muslim who's actually watching this live stream. Pray that this has hopefully had some form of spike of interest in this subject with you, Faisal. They've asked a question if Jay is telling if what Jay is talking about is all true. Why do all historians, including Patricia Croner, agree that Muhammad of the Quran existed? And they've just posted this one here.
Very quickly, let me answer that real quickly. Patricia Croner is a friend of mine. She died in 2015. In 2015, I believe Muhammad existed. I don't think anybody ever believed. We had a man named Robert. I'm terrible with names, so you have to forgive me here. Robert, not Maury. Robert. This book's right here. Did Muhammad exist? Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer wrote a book, Did Muhammad Exist, in 2011. That was the first time even anybody bothered to ask it. And everybody just poo-pooed him when he came out with that in 2011. Now he's rewritten that book in 2021, and now he stands behind everything he says. I've written the foreword on that book. You will see it there. Hey, look at me. I don't even know his name, and I wrote the foreword for him. But when you can see, Fazal, Patricia Crone did not know what we now know today. In just the last 10 years, I would say just the last 5 years, we pretty well know that there was no Muhammad. But this is brand new. And that's why you, Fazal, from here on out, you're going to have to prove that Muhammad exists. This is no longer an academic exercise that did not exist 10 years ago. This is now an academic exercise that most people are now saying. Most scholars today, don't say scholars don't say this. And you're quoting someone from 10 years ago. Please quote scholars from today, like Dr. Stephen Shoemaker or Dr. Robert Kerr, or even the Inada group, all the Inada scholars from Germany, Dr. von Bothmer, Dr. Gerhard Puin, Dr. Elizabeth Puin. Look at all these scholars from the German school. They all pretty much are saying now that there was no Muhammad.
Wow. Well, there you go. Fantastic. Well, that is a lot of information. It all in that. I'm very, very, very much looking forward to your upcoming book. I'm thrilled that you're actually writing all this down. This is going to be fantastic. Just a little sort of reminder: if you do want to do a bit of digging yourself, there is some books you can pick up right now. One is called "Not the Same God" by Sam Solomon. Which deals with comparing is the Quranic Allah the Lord God of the Bible. We've also got a book by Beth Peltola and Tim Dieppe, Questions to Ask Your Muslim Friends, a closer look at Islamic beliefs and texts. There's the cover for that one. And also as well, if you're looking for a cheeky reference to Islam with a refutation, this has come out from Patristic Nectar, called Against All Heresies by St. Simeon of Thessalonica. In there is a fantastic little rebuttal right at the beginning against Muslims that I'll read out really quickly before Jay goes. Against the Muslims, those that we call the heathens. For these at first worshipped the morning star. Later on, they were deceived by some incredibly impious and deranged barbarian of their race. This man lived an impure and lascivious life, causing him to be wholly filled with the operation of the evil one. And even now, we don't even know if he even existed. So that's an interesting development for that one. But thank you so much, Jay, for coming on and sharing that. Genuinely, thank you so much. It really does mean the world. And this is, I'm going to have to read.
I just want to talk, because Fazal is asking, he wants to know who all these scholars are, and he wants to talk to me personally. I'm not going to talk to people personally, because I have thousands that want to talk to me personally. I've come on this show for Sam, because for his sake. But let me say to this, Fazal, if you claim that Muhammad did exist, let's put it right back in your lap. I can pretty well prove that he didn't exist, and I'm going to use only evidence from the 7th century. Now, what I want you to do, Fazal, before you're saying that all historians don't disagree with you, I want you to tell me, show me one historian that can prove that Muhammad did exist from the 7th century. That's a simple question. Let's see if you can answer that.
Yep, and that is now the claim that is in the Muslims' court. It's nice to know the shoe is now on the other foot for a change.
We're in the driving seat on this one, and this is why it's so good, because let me just say this. Not only are we supposed to be in the driving seat, because all these questions have been thrown against us. Therefore, we understand these questions better than anybody else. But we have also passed this test with our Lord Jesus Christ. Since we have passed this test with our Lord Jesus Christ, and Muslims have not even begun to pass this test with their prophet Muhammad, then, of course, we have to ask them, you have to do the same thing we did. We had to prove the historicity of Jesus Christ from the 1st century, which is much more difficult because that's 2,000 years ago. And we had to prove it with material that was written on papyrus, which disintegrates within 100 years. You don't have that excuse. You'd only have to go back 1,400 years, and nothing was written on papyrus. It was all written on vellum and parchment. Prove to us that this man exists from documents that would have been well preserved. 1,400 years is not very long ago. And just give us reference in coins or inscriptions or in any type of documentation for this man, Muhammad, not Muhammad. Don't waste our time with Muhammad. That's Jesus Christ. That's the anointed one. That's a title. With Muhammad, who lived in a place called Mecca and received a book called the Quran. That's all we're asking. It's a simple question. Let's see what you can do.
Yeah, he said Sebos, a Christian bishop, talk about Muhammad in 661.
No, he talked about
Guess
Muhammad. Look at, read it. He taught the Muhammad. He refers to it. Just read it. It's there in the text. Mim ha mim dal.
Wow. Anyway,
Okay.
well, thank you so much, Jay, for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, good luck with the book. I have a feeling it's going to be a smashing success. I know I'm going to be picking up a copy as soon as I can pre-order or get a copy or what have you. Really looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to seeing what else you have planned coming forward. And also as well, I've put his channel in the description below, so please do check that out. There's plenty of content on there. And so thank you very much, Jay, for coming on. God bless you, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. God bless you, and we'll come back again, and we'll be able to pick up some other material the next time.
Yeah, that'd be brilliant. Fantastic. I think I'm going to stay on for a little bit and just have a little chat. So feel free to pop out, Jay. So God bless you, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.